Welcome everybody to this roundtable for Earth Day, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Of course, it's happening during this worldwide pandemic, and I hope everybody who watches is staying as safe and healthy as possible, and hopefully getting the resources you need to keep food on your table and your family safe and secure. We're going to take a couple minutes to allow each of my guest speakers at this roundtable around Earth Day and Earth Week a couple minutes to introduce themselves, who they are and what they do relative to our environment and our planet. We have folks from the business community, from nonprofits, various organizations and individuals that work in arenas that are related to our climate and our Earth. And I'm going to ask you to give us your views from the local level to the global level. And I'm going to start with Bill McKibben, one of the most famous Vermonters that we have, particularly around issues around climate and the Earth and the global issues that are going on. So maybe, Bill, if you could help us out with sort of the big picture, what you see going on.
A pleasure to be with you and everybody else, all the distinguished people on this call. Look, we're at the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Let's start first by giving credit to the people who 50 years ago did some good stuff. That was the biggest day of political action probably in American history. 20 million people in the streets, about 10% of the then population. And the things that they were focused on, clean air in cities, clean water in lakes and streams, they, to a very large extent, got done. They changed the zeitgeist politically so that Richard Nixon, a conservative Republican, had no choice but to sign the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and all the acts that the current conservative Republican is trying to gut in Washington. And it worked. You know, our air in our cities is way cleaner, and our lakes and streams, by and large, are cleaner than they used to be. So much credit to the pioneers who did this work. But of course, the challenges have gotten way more complicated. And I think really right now in the wake of in the course of this pandemic, we can kind of sense that. I think we've learned a couple of things that are worth bearing in mind. One, physical reality is real. You can't spin or shout at or compromise with physics or chemistry, or as we're now finding out, biology. If the coronavirus microbe tells us we need to stand 6 feet apart, then we're going to stand 6 feet apart. It's setting the limit, not us, in the same way that the carbon dioxide molecule is setting real limits. And the second thing is that delay is fatal. You know, the US failure to start compressing the coronavirus curve when it had the chance in February is going to mean that tens of thousands of people die unnecessarily and that we break our economy in lots of painful ways. In just the same way that the failure to start dealing with the carbon curve 30 years ago when science just issued their warning leaves us in a difficult spot now. But of course, it emphasizes the need that we still have to move as fast as we can, faster than we can. Third and final thing really is just the obvious one, that social solidarity is crucial here. That's the way we're going to get out of this. One hopes that the long 40-year period of pretending that markets solve all problems, that government, Ronald Reagan said, the 9 scariest words in the English language were, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Well, that was nonsense when he said it, but it's clearly nonsense now because everyone knows the scariest words in the English language are, we've run out of ventilators, we can only do these things if we do them together. And that's, I think, the real lesson for Earth Day Plus 50.
Thank you. Next, we have Zoraya Hightower, newly elected city councilor in Burlington, who's done some community development work. And Zoraya, why don't you offer us some thoughts?
I want to start off a little bit by saying I love cities. I was born in a large German city, but my parents kept moving me to increasingly rural areas until when I was 11. We moved to a small town in rural Oklahoma, right near the now infamous town of Wynnewood from the Tiger King. But about 4 years ago, I ended up in Burlington, which to me is something in between that urban and rural spectrum. It is maybe the biggest city in Vermont, but by global standards, it's still a small town. And that's certainly how it feels to me, especially after running my first campaign this winter. So looking at cities in the US, I think they've come around to the risk of climate change, even as our federal government has sometimes been slow or even backward. And Burlington itself has certainly been a leader in this space by, for example, becoming the first city in the US to source 100% of our energy from renewable sources. While moving the needle on mitigations efforts, I think cities have really taken a leadership on resilience specifically. This includes the usual parts of public provision, which become easier with density, so getting electricity back up after a storm, but also some of the more nuanced and long-term planning, such as daylighting streams that had been in pipes or underground for years to improve stormwater absorptions and reduce the impact of future flood events. And the way I have seen it is we funded a lot of this resilience incrementally and through growth. So either through revitalization or gentrification of neighborhoods, building the value of a place and then investing in its resiliency at the same time. So maybe when you tear down a building, you put in a new building, maybe you think about putting a green roof on it. Or as cities have grown through infill, we've maybe had a larger tax base and could invest more in public infrastructure, such as daylighting those streams. This moment in time for me is making us think about a couple of things. So first, how do cities and governments engage their residents on things that can't be done just through a top-down model? So when we're talking about decarbonizing our transportation sector, rather than greening our electricity sector, how do cities work with communities to make those efforts grassroots, the way, to Bill's point, Earth Day started? Because if it's behavior change, we're going to have that bottom-up pathway. So really, again, to Bill's point, talking about social solidarity, making cities and governments work together. And then second, we've been funding resilience through urban growth and infill. And I think COVID has made us think about sustainable urban growth. Is that sustainable? Is growth of any kind sustainable? What are our physical limits? And then how do we step back and think about social incrementalism and how delay may be fatal with that kind of incrementalism?
That's great insights to things that people can do and municipalities in particular can do in a state like Vermont with that small municipal area, but also a lot of rural areas. I think it's important for everybody to be thinking about these. And we have some other, quote, urban areas or more denser areas. And our next guests are from Rutland area and right in Rutland. Marlene and Philip with Same Sun Solar Company, a successful solar business, but one that's also maybe had some challenges the last couple of years as state policies change. And then obviously right now with the coronavirus epidemic, that's impacting all businesses across the spectrum. So I'd be curious to hear from you about how your business has been affected by both state policy and coronavirus, but then how important your business is to the new climate economy that we have to have going forward.
So we've been in business since 2011, and yes, we've seen a lot of changes in state policy that have impacted us. I will say that we have a specific business model, which is for ownership of solar arrays for Vermont residents, businesses, and nonprofit institutions, and that informs our views on not only the importance of meeting our climate goals, but the way in which we do it to benefit the residents and businesses of the state. So yes, as far as the coronavirus goes, we're adhering to the policy because our business involves on-site, in-person installation. We're unable to operate at this time, and that's a drag. But we are planning for the rest of the year. So mostly we wanted to talk about just the changes in additional expenses and regulations on our business. I think Philip is going to start on the expense side.
Before I start that, and thank you, Lieutenant Governor, thanks to everybody. It's always inspirational to hear Bill McKibben. And I did want to say that I was a boy 50 years ago and living in Michigan, and the changes that happened to our terribly polluted Pine River where I grew up because of the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. And it impressed me as even a boy that if the problem is made by humans, it can be solved by humans. I think the only silver lining to climate change is we know what's wrong and we know we did it. And since we know what's wrong and we know we did it, there is a chance of changing it. To get into numbers in the state of Vermont, though, the state policies have made solar more difficult and more expensive. In expenses, there was the ending of the Clean Energy Development Fund. That's about 4 years ago. And that organization paid at the beginning $1.75 per DC rated watt. And when the program ended, it was 25 cents a DC rated watt. And what that meant for an average residential Vermonter was at the very end, at the lowest point, they were getting a $2,000 check from the state. That ended about 4 years ago. And the funds, they were not only gone, but they were linked to the RERC, which was the Renewable Energy Resource Center. And that was an organization that also had some quality control. And when the money ended and the quality control ended, that's when we saw the larger out-of-state corporations come in, specifically promoting leases to Vermonters, which has been, in our view, a very terrible thing. So all we were left with in Vermont was the utility tariff, which when it began was the utilities were paying 6 cents a kilowatt hour additionally for every solar renewable kilowatt hour that you created. It's down to 2 cents, and we expect that to be ending soon. And what that meant for an average residential solar array is in the 10-year period, a lot of math here, but in the 10-year period that you were given the tariff or earned the tariff, you could expect to save about $5,500. And that is also gone. Also, the solar array used to attack every aspect of your bill. Our original customers, we've been in business nearly 10 years. The first several years of our business, our customers have literally zero or negative bills. That's not been true for a couple of years now. And the utilities have non-bypassable fees, which is about meters and interconnection, and the utilities promotion of leases, which they also get paid for. You can't avoid that. They've also been charging individuals for interconnection fees that can cost a Vermonter an average of about $1,000 more. Again, I'm talking about small residential homes. But for larger arrays, but that are still net metered, these fees can now go up to, for the interconnection, the reclosers, up to tens and even hundreds of thousands of dollars.
In addition to all of that, there's the regulation aspect, and we sort of live and die by the set of net metering rules that were established by the Public Utilities Commission that went through a big overhaul in 2017. And the biggest change there is that it allowed the municipalities and adjoining landowners the ability to be stakeholders and to comment on development of private land, and do so in a way that they're not necessarily educated to do, because they talk about aesthetics without talking about the real public good that, you know, solar arrays are giving us. They've established a designation called preferred site, which, you know, gives a developer an advantage in the tariff that they received, but again, without educating the municipalities as to what, you know, what it means to give that designation. So it's just become, you know, it's also done without regard for the common equipment that's used. They set sort of arbitrary limits on capacity of what they call the AC capacity of an array based on inverters that one uses without regard to, you know, the real footprint or impact of an array. And it's an expensive and very, very time consuming process that, you know, really makes it difficult for the small business to set a schedule.
Thank you, both Marlene and Philip. And I think obviously you've talked about the really rapidly changing landscape somewhat in the wrong direction with respect to tackling some of the climate change crisis situation that we have, and trying to get more renewable energy. And while Zoraya talked about, you know, Burlington moving towards all renewable energy, which probably we could talk about with scale of some of the hydro, but we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. Our next person is Simon, who is involved with the Hartford area resilience project. I don't know if that's the right title, but ultimately really looking at, as resilience groups all across the state are, actions that can be taken at the local level to really shift communities to being more resilient in an age of climate crisis type weather events, as well as economic development thoughts. So Simon, if you could give us a few of your thoughts, that'd be great.
Thank you also for inviting me onto this roundtable. Yeah, I've been with the Hartford Select Board for the past 9 years, and one of the pretty exciting things that has developed over that time is we have broadened the discussion about community resilience, and in the formation of what's the Community Resilience Organization of Hartford, now called Resilient Hartford. We have the fire department and the town planners and the community organizers all sitting down together for a long-term conversation about resilience. And through that, our definition of resilience has broadened to include not only the sort of man-made disasters, resilience to man-made disasters such as a terrain derailment or a fire, resilience to floods. We have 3 rivers in the town of Hartford, and so we have an intimate relationship with the word resilience through that way. But also resilience to potential supply line interruptions, and the consciousness of a potential for an economic disruption, or you could say collapse, has worked its way into the municipal consciousness by means of the work of this committee. The Select Board now has goals around preparing for a potential supply line interruption, and all of that work came to feel very quite prophetic in a way when the COVID outbreak came along, and all of a sudden we were experiencing supply lines, some people for the supply line interruptions for the first time, famously in the areas of toilet paper and hand sanitizer, but also extending to basic food staples. And many of our supermarkets were putting in their orders to the warehouses and getting back 30% of what they had ordered for a period of time. And so that all has set the stage that in our response to the COVID outbreak, we have a subgroup focused on food availability, which I think is very forward thinking, and I'm very proud that has evolved in that way. Not just in the short term, thinking about how vulnerable populations are receiving food and how food is flowing around the community right now, but the potential for serious dimensions of food insecurity turning into lack of availability for us to be able to get the calories that we need to feed ourselves as communities. I think one of the blessings that we've been aware of for a long time as an organizing community, which is where I kind of come out of the transition town world originally, is that what we would do to build resilience and what we would do to build sustainability, there's such a high degree of overlap between these two areas that in some ways the resilience platform is a very important and effective way of advancing sustainability goals. So those things that we would do to prepare for food resilience also do respond to some of the needs to respond to climate change and that emergency as well.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful information, and it's amazing as we think about what's important, right? We've got food, we've got shelter, we've got communication, we've got health, and I really appreciate all these different perspectives coming in on this conversation. And our next person is Richard Watts. He's a professor at UVM. He's also done a lot of work on planning and transportation issues, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Richard, if you could join us.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody for being here. And I want to say that I actually live just a few miles from our distinguished Lieutenant Governor, and this is, you know, firsthand these issues because I see you're out there on your farm. See these things happening around us. So I'm lucky enough to work at in the university and be surrounded by young people and college students who are really going to be the inspiration and the motivation and the leaders that are going to take us through this. And I get to see that every day. People who are pushing me all the time to do better, and also students who understand, young people in general, how we can address these issues like right now. And I think one of the things this crisis is showing us is that we actually have the capacity to act, and what's happening around us. We have to be really thoughtful and pay attention to people who are not doing well, but there is an opportunity to understand how we could come out of this differently with a lower impact on the environment. And particularly, I think a lot about transportation. That's our largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, both nationally and in Vermont. And are there things that we can do differently? Right now, we are seeing more people walking and biking. Google Analytics has made available the data on how many people are driving. Trips in Vermont are down about 50%, so we have about 50% less traffic in general. And are there ways that we may understand how to move forward here, less dependent on the system that we've built for 80 or 80 years? It's very car oriented, and allow people, even in rural places like we live, that's what I think about a lot, allow people other options for living a rich life and the mobility that they need. And we're going to talk later, I know, about telecommuting, but this is an amazing moment to kind of look around and think about how we could come out of this differently. And the students and young people that I get to work with are doing that now. They walk more, they bike more, they ride transit more, they're less interested in driving. And so those are all hopeful signs, I think, for us as we think about coming out of this.
So we're going to talk about a few different issues with our environment, our economy. We've got housing, transportation, business, our communities, the state, and the world. Just a few minor things to cover at a few minutes at a time. But we're going to start our conversation around building resilience. We are currently working in this traumatic moment where everybody's reacting to the situation. In many cases, folks are really stepping up with mutual aid groups and community groups, but a lot of resilience is around planning and preparation ahead of time. And so I'm going to turn to Simon first, and then we'll just see where it goes from there. But just curious about ways that we can plan for resilience while also building our economy at the same time, so that when we face these catastrophes, we're in a better position to do so.
I think that the really important place to start in the conversations about building community resilience and about sustainability as well is around a very broader sense of wakefulness to the kinds of problems that we are confronting. And I almost feel like in the working in the municipal sector that the degree of lack of awareness of counter narratives that might disrupt our assumptions around business as usual thinking are analogous to a form of somnambulism. And so for me, and this goes simultaneously for climate change, it also goes for the work we need to do to put very, very intense economic disruptions and the potential for economic collapse. And so we've been involved in conversations in the town of Hartford on the subject of parking. And I mentioned this earlier, is the potential to build a parking garage. The parking garage is if to somebody who is fully awakened to the nature of our potential economic precariousness and also fully awakened to the nature of our climate emergency, to construct a concrete parking garage is you wouldn't even consider it. You know, it would be so far off the table, and yet the inertia of the kind of the momentum of our sort of models of we need to preserve the economy, we need to support growth in the downtown, we need to give people places to park their cars, and not moving into the realm of thinking, which is we need to create a whole new society because the potential for human extinction is on the table. So we need to move dramatically and rapidly into radically new ways of thinking and living and interacting, and we need to do it, right now, if not 30 years ago. So so I think that there's for people who are doing community work around, for the purposes of building resilience or for the purpose of responding to the climate emergency, I think that the front line of that is wakefulness. Is what we can do to wake ourselves up and continuously bring to mind the awareness. I think that due to the work of people like Bill McKibben, and so many others, our progress with regards to becoming aware of the climate emergency is probably a little bit ahead of our awareness to becoming aware of the potential for economic collapse. But we've had some, in 2008, we had a very, very close brush with a global collapse that, as many people who are in the position to know said, we were hours away from doing irreparable damage to the global economy in a way that would not be able to be put back together in the short term. And now with the COVID-19 outbreak, we are also seeing, signs of the economic frailties that are built into our system. It should alert us all to the need for an all hands on deck approach to providing for the necessities of all of the people in the community. And so and many people are, and that, I would say an appropriate response to this would be taking parkland and starting to grow vegetables on it, or taking a very, very aggressive approach to what it would take to supply the calories that we need within the state of Vermont. That's one of the things that we're focused on in response to the outbreak. But I think that we have a beautiful opportunity here, and I know that there's, I am acutely aware of the suffering and the loss of life and the intense uneasiness that the outbreak has brought to our country and our world as a whole. But I think that the disruption to our thinking and the way in which our assumption that everything is going to continue in just the same way, and that we, as Bill pointed out at the beginning, that we don't have to yield to the basic laws of science or modify our behavior in response to fundamental realities of our world, has been disrupted. And in that disruption, we're in a period of great opportunity to imagine a new world and opportunity to work together to create it.
I appreciate that. I was actually going to maybe turn to Bill for a moment to talk about resilience and what he's heard around the world. I mean, we have so many different cultures and economies, and he's got this global connection. What might some of your thoughts be on building a resilient economy and environment for our future?
To build on what Simon was saying, the world is a big, complicated place, and it's bound together in lots of ways that we're not going to soon get rid of. But I think that there's no question that coming off of this crisis, we're probably going to want to remind ourselves that having built an economy that focused on growth above all, we're probably at a place where we're going to want to focus more on resilience, on security, on a kind of safety above all. Think about the difference between a racehorse, a thoroughbred designed to run super fast on a super flat, dry race course, and a draft horse designed to take what trouble throws at it. I have a feeling we're moving in that direction. David, I remember interviewing you probably 20 years ago, and we were around the Intervale one day, and the question I asked you was, if everything, if for some reason Vermont suddenly couldn't communicate with the rest of the world, couldn't get materials in from anywhere else, how long would it take us to be food self-sufficient? Which is, of course, the single number one question you'd want to know about resiliency. And you said something that cheered me up immediately. You said, I think we'd be there within one growing season because we have high mowing seeds at work in Vermont. We have a source of maybe the most important thing there is. And I was actually really pleased to note the other day that high mowing seeds is busily trying to hire more people because demand for their product is up so much. We're capable of being energy self-sufficient and resilient and reliant here. And thanks to people like Marlene and Philip, we're kind of heading in that direction. And we're capable of having great outreach to the rest of the world that doesn't necessarily require visiting them all the time. I mean, one of the things we're learning in this current crisis is that we're capable of doing a certain amount of travel by mouse and modem as opposed to jet plane. So I think we're headed in some directions. I mean, there's no silver linings to a pandemic. There's too many deaths and too much dislocation and too much sadness in every way. But as I was saying earlier, if we're going to go through this, we might as well learn something from the process. And I think we're learning a few lessons about resilience. I will say, you mentioned one of them right in your opening, David. If we're going to be doing, one of the things we're going to need to make a lot of this work that we don't have in Vermont and that every governor keeps promising us we're going to have is broadband internet that actually works across the state of Vermont. It's times like this when we begin to realize just how dumb it is to have, a third of the state in a kind of internet desert.
Thank you. And Marlene, maybe if you have a quick thought, because we're going to get to the next section here, but I was thinking about energy resilience, and if you all can offer a little bit about what solar and renewable energy might mean for that.
I wanted to say something, and this does deal with the resilience, about the parking lot that was mentioned earlier. One of the things that I think is very, very attractive to living in Vermont, we have friends in New York City, we have friends in San Francisco, we lived in both those cities. And one of the things is I'm walking around my 2 acres and my big house, and I can come to my office because it's empty. We're very lucky to have space, and what space means, and I think people are going to enjoy their space more and more than if we were living in 800 square foot in Manhattan. I don't even know how we'd stay 6 feet away from people. If I was building a parking lot in Burlington or here in Rutland, I think that's a really good idea, as long as you take the entire top of the roof. If the city can require that the entire top of the roof be a solar array, that would be a massive amount of solar that would take up no footprint other than the parking lot. Parking lots are strong, they can carry the weight of the solar array. You have a canopy on top, and the people who get to park on top get covered parking. Also, a parking garage would have the ability to keep battery backup storage. So your parking garage could be a source of power and a source of sustainability for the city that it's in. And then if you allowed electric cars to park there for free, other than our trucks, because our trucks won't carry the weight of our jobs, all of our vehicles at Same Sun are electric. If you would allow those electric cars to park for free at a reduced rate, then you could have those people coming into town, and the people who are driving gas cars may have to pay a higher rate to participate in the town. But I think we, as Vermonters, we both want the space for our homes, which means we have to drive vehicles, and we want to come into towns for the life spread of the town. Here in Rutland, that's the Paramount Theater. With the Paramount Theater closed, that's what drives all the restaurants. So I think if you want to walk around a town, enjoy theater, performance, and restaurants, then you need parking garages. But parking garages themselves can be mandated by the authorities to be a self-sustaining solar array with battery backup storage and charging stations. Then I think you could have the best of all possible worlds.
Since we're talking about parking, the next topic was actually going to be transportation. And clearly with the COVID-19 crisis that we're in right now and the fact that people are staying at home, transportation has come up as a topic, particularly around the issue of telecommuting and broadband. But what do we need to do to help our businesses, help our education situation, and help even with transfers of information around transportation issues? And then with broadband, it's also revealing huge inequities. So as talked about earlier, I think Bill mentioned a third of our state not having really decent broadband. And how can we not be driving to work if we're hoping people do telecommuting when you can't telecommute if you don't have broadband? And these inequities are both geographic and economic and cultural. So I think we're gonna have a few different folks that could probably chime in on these kinds of issues. So Richard, maybe you could get us started on some of the thoughts about opportunities we have towards building towards a resilient future, but also some of those challenges with transportation and maybe broadband.
You have to remember that the system we have is based on about 80 or 90 years of investing in car infrastructure. And there are plenty of models around the world, even in rural places, where people can drive less. We know that in Vermont, we actually are overbuilt on our parking by about 60%. So if you're in any town or city in Vermont, most of the time those parking lots aren't used. That space, it could be reused for the town for other purposes, for green space, for agriculture. And we also know that in Vermont, a quarter, 1 out of 4 of our trips are a mile or less. So those are trips that could potentially be captured by walking or biking if you felt safe. And even in the rural places of Vermont, like where I live, you don't always feel safe to walk or bike on our roads. So this might be a moment to take all this capacity we have, all this infrastructure we have, and start rethinking a little bit about how we make it safe to capture, or safer to capture, some more trips that aren't car dependent. And in some places we are doing that. In Burlington and Brattleboro and other places, they're starting to repurpose or figure out ways in which a street could be shared safely with all users. So we have to think about streets as not being just for cars, but being for about all the types of people who use them. Telecommuting, right now in Vermont, pre-COVID, 5 to 7% of people telecommuted on a regular basis. What we're learning in this crisis is that telecommuting actually does work for many more people. Businesses are understanding that it works for their employees, and employees are understanding some of the benefits of doing it. Some research suggests that as much as 25 or 30% of Vermonters could telecommute in some way going forward. And I don't mean to minimize in any way the inequitable distribution of how broadband resources benefit some parts of the state and not others. But this is a moment to think about those investments and this is really, David, your camp, figure out how we actually can do what, as Bill said, governors have been saying we're going to do for decades, and make broadband distribution more equitable. But we know that 25 to 30% of us in the types of jobs that we have could reduce how much we drive. Would that mean we spend more time in our local communities? Yes. And really interesting work by Robert Putnam has found that every 10 minutes you spend commuting, every 10 minutes you spend driving outside your community, you're 10% less likely to be engaged in your local community. So I think there's much broader societal impacts by helping people to drive less and enabling us to do more things close by. So those are just some thoughts. I want to add that this 25% or less, 1 mile, it's also 40% of all our trips are 2 miles or less. So there's definitely some space in there to enable people to drive less.
Thank you, Richard. Zoraya, I was curious if you had any thoughts you wanted to offer on that with respect to transportation issues being in a denser area and broadband, and then again, some of the different inequities that you might see in your district in Burlington even, where some folks might have broadband going by their house, but can they afford to buy it?
So I think, especially, I have given a lot of thought to the transportation issues and how we talk about transportation, because if we think about, again, kind of going back to the urban sphere, most cities that we have in the US, you couldn't rebuild the way that they are based on the zoning that we have. And Burlington zoning is definitely very restrictive on parking and really contributing to that kind of overbuilding of parking space that we're talking about. And when we think about how expensive land is across our state, really, but I think especially in Burlington and the surrounding areas, all of that could be used to really, I mean, having a mandatory parking space in so many areas is increasing the cost of housing for plenty of people who maybe can't even afford to own a car, but they already have a parking spot kind of locked into their home. So I think definitely this, now that we're just seeing, you know, parking lot after parking lot basically empty, hopefully will have us rethink the conversation around how can we move to more shared models, knowing that most trips are so short. How do we have parking spaces that are shared between homes and shared between businesses, and reduce kind of the parking burden on our cities, so that we can have increased space for things that we need, like solar panels and things like housing. Yeah, then on the broadband issue, I think that this is something that definitely I haven't seen. I know that this is an ongoing conversation in terms of rural and urban. It's also obviously a conversation within cities. And I think this is a conversation where we have to talk about not leaving people behind.
Thank you for these thoughts, each of you, on that. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of proposals nationwide, and even some conversation at the state level about a Green New Deal or a Green Mountain New Deal, and sort of what that means in Vermont, the connection between housing and transportation, energy use, weatherization, sort of how all of these things are interconnected. But again, particularly our housing and energy consumption in our homes and our environment. And, you know, we just talked about transportation and how that's linked in as well. What sorts of opportunities and challenges do we have in the housing sector? And maybe there's past development patterns we've got in Vermont that we could look at that have worked or not worked. Maybe we've got possible ideas that we can learn from other places that would make our communities more resilient and more sustainable when we think about housing development. Zoraya, I don't know if you could actually start on that one and give us some thoughts.
I think Vermont's Green New Deal is a commitment to reducing our environmental impact while not leaving our residents behind. And I think housing is a big one on this. And I think we have more evidence today that we can do this than we've ever had before. As we're thinking about resilience, looks like when we are thinking about large natural disasters like floods and fires that threaten our physical infrastructure, now we've got kind of old and new disasters that disrupt our societal and economic infrastructure. And a basic way to combat these is through basic provision of public services, again, housing being a big one. In the past month, I know that we've managed to house kind of all of the houseless individuals and families in Burlington. Cities have been talking about that being almost impossible for so long and too expensive, or just like not wanted. And now that we're in this kind of crisis moment, we just made it happen, and it just wasn't the hardship that sometimes it was made out to be. I think our housing problems are, kind of to Philip's point, human made, and therefore this solution is absolutely within our grasp. And then talking kind of, I think, even beyond that, because as we talk about housing and density and how that also impacts the environment, I think we very quickly have to look beyond just a city if we want to think about resiliency in terms of housing and needs. So looping back on Simon's discussion on the food system, it's really hard to be resilient when your nutritional needs are being met by this international supply chain. And so many of us are already struggling with food insecurity in a market system that just does not care about equity. Same for producers. It's hard for them to be resilient when your profitability depends on a global milk market or global oil prices. And so I feel like in these times, we see we see families turning to local food solutions. And I think we're seeing families and households turn to solutions that are, and cities turn to solutions that have been within our grasps the entire time and that make us more resilient, both as kind of households, especially if we now have housing, but also that the government really feels the ability to provide some of that, like housing, but then that local producers also can just take more in providing that resiliency of cities, and vice versa, where we're really depending on kind of our entire regional ecosystem instead of just ourselves and the global market.
I'm going to switch over to Simon, because how are we going to build our economy of the future and our resilience for the future and our climate all together is an arena I think you've got a lot to participate with.
One of the lessons for me recently is the way in which I spoke previously about the relationship between resilience and sustainability. And this leaves out the whole social justice dimension of what we need to take to put squarely on the table. And what I am finding is that when we do that, and that is to say, when we centralize our ability to meet the needs of those who are most vulnerable, or respond to the needs of both with regards to housing and food, the more we are opening up systems which are truly sustainable and truly resilient. And I'll give you an example, both of which having to do with two examples, both of which having to do with the growing homeless community in the region where I am right now. First of all, with regards to housing, the Upper Valley is estimated to be at least 5,000 units short. In other words, the municipal and nonprofit sectors together are not able to come near meeting the demand for housing that we need to do. And that's prior to very predictable influx of climate refugees coming from coming up from the south, and I mean Boston and New York, in the event of greater climate disruption, which is entirely predictable. And meanwhile, currently we have a community of approximately 40 to 70 individuals who are unhoused. And recently we were thinking about creating emergency shelter, because when the COVID outbreak came on, it became clear that having people tenting out and with no home was not compatible with the governor's orders to stay at home. And we had some experience putting together geodesic domes that would provide emergency shelter. I'm very, very interested in this model as a way of responding to the end of the cold weather period when the hotel vouchers run out and we have 70 people coming out of the hotels essentially onto the streets, far, far overwhelming our capacity in the homeless shelter network. Now, what happens if we take seriously this need for housing and centralize it and just say we as a community are going to prioritize our ability to create these kinds of shelter encampments that are going to be heatable, that are going to have some kind of sanitary facilities? All of a sudden, we're creating a different kind of community, which is simultaneously what? Resilient and sustainable. In other words, these encampments could be operating at a responsible level of carbon emission. And by means of witnessing and participating into these alternative ways of living, it's opening our minds to the fact that we don't, every family doesn't need 3,000 square feet of housing, because that is completely unsustainable. Similarly, with regards to providing food during the epidemic, we are building mutual aid networks that are involving the general citizenry to band together and figure out how to meet the needs of people. And we're building a radically different kind of community that is resilient, and that is also very low carbon impacts, ways of getting needs met at the local level. So again and again, every time I feel like we have taken the needs of the most vulnerable and centralized and say, we're going to meet these first, it is generating an environment of thought and experimentation in which we're creating structures which actually meet the other two demands with regards to sustainability and resilience. So more and more, this epidemic is showing to me that these three aspects of resilience, sustainability, and social justice are very intimately linked together. It doesn't always matter exactly where we start, but I think that there's a lot of value of simply starting with the social justice.
Relating to a resilient economy and resilience in general, of course, is energy. We keep a lot of our food chilled. We need energy for warmth in the winter. And we have a lot of people in our business sector in Vermont looking at renewable energy, but we've also lost 500 jobs or so in, I believe, the solar field alone in these last couple of years. And instead of maybe moving forward with more energy resilience and diversified energy, we are sort of stopping in that as much progress as we could be having in that direction. And I'm wondering if Philip and Marlene, you could offer some thoughts on that and maybe tell us where we're going and how we can get there.
When we hear a Green New Deal, we're sort of in a little bit of conflict between our desire as environmentalists to see, as much deployment of solar energy as we can, meaning these, big solar fields, and our, desire is for our own business and for what we want to do with the population to give Vermonters the best solution for them, which is continued deployment of small scale solar that, really gives them the most, bang for their collective buck and creates the kind of on-site jobs that are what Vermont needs to keep, to keep young people in the state, to keep them engaged, to, not everyone wants to telecommute. A lot of, we find a lot of young people are coming to the state because they love to be outside and to work with their hands. And this is a field that, we find young people are really grateful to have found. And we don't want to see those jobs replaced with, much more inexpensive labor from larger companies that come from out of state.
What I want to add to what Marlene is saying is to make a distinction. Environmentally, if you're just counting clean kilowatt hours, then the multi-megawatt solar arrays, the 5 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres that are being taken up is the best thing you can do environmentally and financially. But if you care about Vermont businesses and Vermont residents and the jobs that we create, those things aren't helping at all. So what I'd like to see from Vermont, from the next governor, I hope, and I hope it is you, David, is to understand that a portion of the clean energy we want to generate needs to save Vermonters real money. And the only way to do that is to incentivize the business community and residential. And the good jobs are like our company's good jobs, which is that years ago, we adopted the $15 minimum wage. Our people make between $15 and $50 an hour. They have health benefits and other benefits. And these are people in their 20s and 30s, by and large. Most of them we have Green Mountain College behind us, which is sadly no more. Many of them are Green Mountain College graduates. So that the kind of people you want to stay in Vermont need those jobs. The megawatt solar fields are usually almost always out of state and out of country companies that bring in cheap labor to build these, and they're basically done with them. So a clean kilowatt hour is a clean kilowatt hour, and the environment doesn't care how that energy is made. But if you care about other aspects of our community, it matters greatly the sort of jobs that the state is supporting. And the state, those jobs that you see that were lost, David, you saw the state, the federal government, the utilities, all in the same line up until 2016. And since then, it's been falling. Our company, Same Sun of Vermont, we have been in growth, but many of the local companies have gone away. And I fear that by 2022, if this continues, there'll be 1 or 2 national and international solar companies in the state who produce solar with far fewer jobs than we're seeing now.
So for resilience, we're not just talking about the type of energy we're using, but also the people who are implementing that through their businesses, through the employees in their jobs, and so forth. Is that fair?
That is fair.
I was going to ask an additional question on that in terms of small business, but also Philip, you can add more. Solar is one small business. There's lots of other small businesses. So it's not just energy, but the broader other business issues you've run into that may or may not be necessarily related to the product you sell, but to operating a small business.
This crisis has shown that we have to separate health insurance from jobs. And the fact that, so many people are now unemployed and, many, not all, but many are losing now their health care benefits. That is obviously a big problem. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is that as far as Green New Deal goes, that we talked about, our transportation infrastructure and our broadband infrastructure and housing. But we also have to consider our electrical infrastructure and how we can modernize our grid to support our renewable energy goals, and who is responsible for that. Because right now, a lot of it is falling on the backs of the solar developer who wants to add clean energy to the distribution system. And, the system by which it's decided who pays for that is, we think, not always fair.
The utilities in the last 2 years have been put the burden of modernizing the grid solely on the solar designers and installers, which means on the solar customers. And the government of Vermont has stood behind that every step of the way and have really shifted the responsibility to the clean energy movement. And if this continues, that will also be the collapse of this industry as a local sustaining and high-paying jobs for Vermonters.
Richard, you had some thoughts?
Some of what we're talking about is so important, as the investment in energy, and I understand the nuances here of making sure those jobs are Vermonters. But when it comes to the transportation sector, for example, we spend more than $1 billion a year, almost all of which leaves Vermont. So investing in doing this stuff here means jobs and keeping those dollars in Vermont.
So far, we've had a really rich and healthy conversation that's bounced around to a number of different issues around the earth and our resilience and some of the different factors in our society that are important, and really how interconnected they all are. And so I'm just wondering if we could maybe wrap the end of this conversation in terms of the roundtable before closing statements with interconnectedness, how we can lean into this interconnected nature of things that we're talking about, and find opportunities that we're learning from others, both on this conversation, but really in all of our different communities, about the assets that we all bring to the table, the ideas, the abilities to find climate-friendly solutions at our local level, even in this really unfortunate time of the COVID-19 epidemic. I'm actually wondering if we can go back to Zoraya on this to start, to talk about some of these interconnected things and issues and what we can see going forward.
Going back to how do we look at some of the most vulnerable populations, which is what we're often doing right now, and then seeing how do we make those populations resilient. I think that that's such a good way to start in terms of thinking of the community of resilience, because if they're the ones who are kind of lacking the most resilience, then as we think about how we move that forward, I think we'll often see all of the different ways kind of that our cities, and I think our societies more broadly, are failing to provide that resilience on a systemic basis, is one lens that I would look at it as. And then I think the second one is just I often work with a lot of community advocates, and I think right now we're really seeing a coming together of people talking not about just their issues, but really cross-sector issues. So I'm an environmentalist, but as I've been moving into government roles, I've had to very much think about public health and other things that I'm not as fluent in. And I think that's kind of creating a language and an organization of how do we work together to like move this forward, and hopefully will foster relationships and other actions so that when we're thinking about issues, we're thinking about them with different people who usually aren't at the table, and that will also be a very important part of it.
Thank you. I was going to turn maybe to Simon for some thoughts on this, because again, as you've been thinking about a resilient community, you've had all these different factors of what is a resilient community about. Can you talk about that interconnectedness a little bit more?
I think that the reality of interconnectedness is actually an emergent and true kind of paradigm with regards to the way this world, and I would say universe, works. We are interconnected and radically so in ways that go much beyond the sort of materialistic notion of looking at different human beings as different physical bodies and everybody separate from one another. And that is also an emotional experience which is brought to the forefront by the COVID outbreaks. This is, I think, the first time in my life that I felt so connected to the entire planet. We're all dealing with the same thing together. We're all thinking the same thing together. And so when we go out onto the street and we're bumping into our neighbors, and so many people have said this to me, and I've also had the very same experience, where you walk down the street and two people walking down the street going by one another right now during the outbreak are not going to pass one another without greeting and maybe even pausing to talk, saying, how are you doing? How is your family? How are you weathering the quarantine period? What's going on? And maybe even, by the way, you don't know me, I'm your neighbor, but do you have my number? Is there some way that I can support you in what you're confronting? That's an expression of our recognition of our fundamental interconnectedness. And that same dynamic, when it comes to working in groups, is the basis of our collective creativity and the synergy of thinking that emerges when we sit down together and think, okay, we have this problem. Now, how are we going to together find a solution to it? That same dynamic is what allows us in different silos in different spheres, as we've been talking: energy, transportation, housing. These are sometimes siloed spheres that have different lenses through which they view the world, or maybe they identify the problems differently. But clearly, to think holistically about a different future, we're going to need all of these silos to work together. And the last thing I'll just say is that more and more we need to break down barriers between left and right. Personally, I don't believe much in the difference between left and right ends of the political spectrum, the Republicans, the Democrats, or whatever it is. But our ability to recognize common cause across those divides is rooted and grounded in our fundamental interconnectedness as human beings. So I think that that aspect is a very central thing to bring forward with regards to how we're going to make our way forward. Thank you, David, for highlighting that.
I want to thank all of you for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation for me. I hope for our viewers as well. This conversation with different perspectives from around the state, geographically, as well as topic areas of expertise, and really shows how, as we're thinking about our future in the state, the climate crisis and Earth Day, how each of us has these different roles to play, and our broad knowledge and what we each have to offer is important. So I've really valued the conversation with our folks here. Philip and Marlene, do you want to give a 1-minute sort of wrap up of your thoughts about this?
Thank you, first of all, Lieutenant Governor, for having us here. One of the interesting things about the circumstances we find ourselves in is that Marlene and I are invited to a number of things in Burlington and Montpelier, and we're never able to go. So we're running a business and we're down here in Rutland, so we don't get to things. So because of this technology and your invitation, we were able to participate. And I agree completely with what Simon said. I've never felt so connected to the other 7 billion people on this planet. But we were invited here as the business people. So I just want to say, on a local level, what's happening in Vermont is that, to sum up what I said earlier, every clean kilowatt hour is a good clean kilowatt hour. But to protect local businesses, to save real Vermonters money, to save residents money, we really have to protect the good paying clean energy jobs here to make those kilowatt hours count both environmentally and economically.
And I'll echo the sentiment about connectiveness because yes, this crisis has sort of caused a checking in with people that I haven't spoken to, in a while, or just the fact that we can all stay in touch and, find out how each other are doing is very important. But yes, to sort of sum up, we wanted to just express, the pleasure that we've had to sit at the kitchen table of so many of our, customers, Vermont residents that have taken control, generating their energy. And we think that really causes a buy-in of the individual to the collective goals of the state. And that without that, the idea of, cleaning the grid and generating renewable energy is just a sort of a distant thing. And, I wanted to make the analogy, especially to you, David, that I'm sure you want, kids to really understand where food comes from. And we really want kids to understand where electricity can come from, because it is that next generation that's going to, really make the demands that our electricity is clean and it's renewable.
Richard, do you want to offer a closing thought?
Thank you, David. And we are, I think, doing this in honor of the climate and the environment. And I agree with all these great folks about how connected we all feel and how much, more time we take now to go out and feel nature around us. And I would say, putting on my transportation hat, when you're out there walking around or biking or whatever, think about, is there some other way that I might be able to go forward when we come out of this? Because it really is a moment for us to think differently about how we might emerge. And so I'm really hopeful that out of this crisis comes some rethinking of all this capacity and way we can go forward to have less impact on the environment from a transportation point of view.
Simon, do you have some thoughts you want to close us with?
I really appreciate, David, you're setting up this panel discussion, and I've enjoyed the conversation with all of the other folks on the panel very much. I do am been very much aware of the need for visionary leadership at this time, and as we've responded to the crisis, I've been kind of looking around for it in my town and listening for it, and I think that it mirrors sort of where we are historically at this time, which is that the visionary statement about what our future could be needs to be the basis of our path forward. And I would even say beyond visionary, the prophetic voice is the voice that we need to be making room for at this time here. If it is not speaking boldly about something radically different that's beyond, that's shockingly and surprisingly outside of our field of view, and that is beyond our kind of immediate assumptions about the way this world works, that it's probably not going to go far enough. It's probably going to be a half measure. So the way in which our minds have been opened up by the experience of being during the COVID outbreak, I think it definitely prioritizes again the necessity for, and opens up the potential to hear these alternative views and also to speak them ourselves.
Thank you, Simon. Bill, do you have something you want to offer to close us out?
What a pleasure to get to join with everybody. We have enormous challenge in front of us, probably the biggest challenge that humans have ever dealt with. And there's a weird way in which this pandemic has been kind of like the climate crisis condensed into 6 weeks instead of 3 decades. And it's taught us a few things about our ability to move fast when we need to and to join together when we need to. Those better be lessons we take out of here, because one of the options is not just going back to some idea of what was normal before. If we just set up all the pins in the bowling alley again, then what happens is utterly predictable from here on out. So this means everything. This means, for instance, our legislators and leaders in Montpelier actually getting it together this year to divest from fossil fuel. I mean, it's too bad that everybody waited until the oil companies had lost all their value, but it's still an important thing to be doing, to send a signal that we're not going to be part of this. This means doing the things that we've been talking about around broadband, around food security, around transportation, around housing density, around all those things. Maybe what we're learning right now is that we've got to actually face up to the things that we've been talking about for a long time and get them done. That the world is running out of margin for us to just keep kind of kicking things down the road every year and doing making the tiniest little down payment on reality. We're up against, reality left to its own devices will eventually bite you in the butt, and that's what's going on now. So Vermonters are better than other people, many other people, at figuring out how to make do with what they have, but trying to rally together to get things done. We have higher degrees of social trust than other parts of the world. These are assets with which we should now mobilize to take this most beautiful of places and these most intact and wonderful of communities and cities, and really make sure that we're going to be here for the long haul. So many thanks to everybody on this call, and many thanks to the Lieutenant Governor, who's been a great leader in this work for a very long time.
Thank you, Bill. Zoraya, what are your thoughts as we wrap up this conversation?
We've talked about obviously a wide array of what's important for resilience, whether that's housing systems, transportation systems, food systems, health insurance systems. And I think it's going to be a big task for government officials going forward, especially on the state level, but also on the municipal level. And really all of the citizens to be aware of is how we combine those for resilience, because it's much harder to think about any of those systems independently if you want to really make a resilient system. When you're thinking about housing, you've got to think about transportation, how your transportation requirements and needs are fitting into that, how your local food systems are working, and whether that's working with how your grocers are operating in your cities. And it's definitely a challenge for the next foreseeable future, but I think it's also inspiring how we've seen so many communities tackle this with really very little time to react, but reacting to it in a way that often is very comprehensive, and treating residents of all kinds with that bare minimum, like we will provide for everyone what they need, even as we're thinking about transitioning to a more sustainable economy. So I am in some ways very heartened by what we've seen in Vermont and globally over the past few weeks, and I hope that we can continue that narrative into the future.
I want to thank everybody for watching on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. I was involved in the 20th anniversary back at UVM on organizing and trying to bring in sort of interdisciplinary thoughts then as we are now. I think it's becoming yet more appropriate now as we're learning during this COVID-19 how important all these different facets are to what's essential in our daily lives and how can we come together for a healthy planet for moving forward together. I hope this conversation has been a benefit for all the viewers who are watching it. And as we grow in this, as we get through this pandemic together and we're looking at where we're going to go next, I think these connections that Simon and others were just talking about with our neighbors, with our communities, and even as Phil talked about the connection to all the people on the planet that this virus has made us so potently apparent about. I think that same connection as we think about our planet as the place we live on, the place that provides our food, our energy, and the materials for our shelter, and the need of our really recognizing that interconnected aspect of our lives, of our communities, and our needs, we will all work together. So these guests that we had today at this roundtable, I want to thank all of you for being here. The assets that we have in this state are truly remarkable as we travel across the state virtually and someday again in person. And I hope that folks are learning through these mutual aid groups and others how we can come together, how that when we come together, we really can improve the lives of all of our neighbors while caring for our impact on our planet. Thank you all for this conversation.